Hello, I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of chats Mark Allen and I have had over recent years, some between ourselves and others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you'd like to help make sure they continue, you might consider being a Patreon supporter by visiting patreon.com/wordinyour-ear, or just by liking or subscribing in whatever way you prefer. On with the show.
Welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear, and a book that is just so original and so revealing. It's a series of musicians seen through the eyes of a small child living in Rockfield Studios in Wales, where her mum was the cook, cooking up, boeuf bourguignon for Motorhead and salmon on croute for David Bowie. And it's called My Family and Other Rock Stars by Tiffany Murray. Tiffany, lovely to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you both.
Not at all. Now, look, explain, first of all, the setup. We're all familiar with Rockfield. It's been around for, best part of 50 years now, I think. But when did it start? It's a converted farmhouse, isn't it, in Wales? When did it start as a studio? And when did your mum kind of get the job to be the live-in chef, as it were?
Well, it started in the mid-60s, I believe. Charles and Kingsley Ward, who were the two brothers whose family owned the farm. It's still a working farm. They loved Elvis Presley, and they formed a group called the Charles and Kingsley Combo, went up to London and tried to seek their fortune and tried to record. And the story I've been told by Kingsley is that they basically got home and thought, well, hold on, we can record here. And they put, if anybody's seen that wonderful documentary, Rockfield, the Studio on the Farm, they put pig feed bags in the attic walls in their parents' farmhouse, and they recorded in the attic. And then gradually over time, all these outbuildings would be converted. So I think, first of all, it was Studio 2, which is still Studio 2, the coach house. That was converted. And then in 74, when my mother arrived, that up in the quadrangle where all the stables are, that became the quadrangle studio, or as we called it, Studio 1. But really, it was also to do with local musicians supporting it in the early days. So you have Dave Edmunds, Elephant's Memory, Mott the Hoople. And then gradually all these engineers and producers would pop up and be regulars there. So my future stepfather, Fritz Fryer, he recorded there in the late 60s. And that's really how it grew. That's how it grew, and it's booming even today. It's a wonderful place.
At the beginning of the book, you're I suppose only about 5 or 6 years old or whatever. But who were the first musicians that you remember actually arriving there? What was your first memories of that?
Well, my first memories of musicians arriving at our house were when we lived just over the border in Herefordshire at this place called the Old Vicarage. And my mum, she had this huge house. It wasn't hers. It belonged to the guy we were living with, and she needed some income. So she put an advert in the Times that said, rehearsal space for bands No Heavy Rock. And the first band to come were Black Sabbath.
So, No Heavy Rock.
It's very odd things. Right. Very odd proviso to put in there.
Well,
it's usually no time wasted.
Yeah. No Heavy Rock. No dogs.
Yeah. Quite. Well, that does pop up later in the book. But I did ask her, why did you specifically say No Heavy Rock? And she said, well, this guy we were living with, Jackson, she said, well, I thought Jackson would hate it. He did, because he preferred Land of Hope and Glory. So we had Black Sabbath rehearsing, and then they went on to Rockfield. I think they went on to Rockfield after that. So they were the first band. And then Queen, who I truly remember because there's this, basically Freddie adored my animals, so that was lovely. And I love
your description of him. You said he smelt of sweet wood and oranges. So it's such an original thing to say about somebody seen from a 6-year-old point of view.
Well, we are, kids. We're all about, it's all about the senses, obviously. And I did ask, because this is years and years of interviewing not only my parents but everybody at Rockfield and various musicians as well. And I said to Mum, why did he smell like that? And she turned to me and she said, oh, darling, it's Givenchy. I was like, oh, okay. But apparently that's Givenchy, sweet wood and oranges.
Yeah, well, it works.
It works. But he loved I had a beautiful Great Dane called Cleo, and he would follow her around. And there's this beautiful picture. It's actually Brian May's picture, and he allowed me to use it for the book, where Freddie is hugging Cleo from behind with this sort of look of love on his face. And
you can remember, I don't know if it was that time, maybe it was the time after, you can remember hearing the words Galileo being recorded again and again and again. And that's an interesting thing as to when you first connected with the fact that the music being recorded there was actually now successful and coming back off your television.
Well, yes, that was when we had moved to Rockfield. We lived in the quadrangle with the band. So there was a line of chalets and we'd be in one, and, you know, maybe Freddie would be in the other, and another band. You know, there were lots and lots of bands there in 75. And I just remember, and I would talk to the other Rockfield kids about, even though we're all in our bloody 50s now, I talked to the other Rockfield kids about it. And they said, yeah, God, I just remember this internal Galileo. That's from a kid's point of view. I mean, most people will be. So we never ever computed that the sound coming out of the studio, which would, let's face it, we know how studios work. It would never really be a whole song until you got to the final playback. No. It would just be dum 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 dum, or buh buh, and so the repetition. You were deaf to it most of the time, but I remember the repetition of that all the time, layering the voices. We did go a bit mad, but then when we saw them on Top of the Pops that Christmas, and Christmas 75, or it was from November, really, it was number one, I think. We were astounded because just seeing their faces going round. Did they go round and round, or were they just lit up? And we were like, oh, that's that man. Oh, that's Freddie, that's Brian. And so that little, I think that was one of the coming of age moments where, as kids, you kind of think, oh right, oh okay. He's the one that didn't like salmon,
but that's right. It is kind of odd thing, isn't it? That all children grow up regarding whatever their surroundings happen to be as being just standard, just boring, really, you know. And whereas it's only in your case that you know, after all these years, you can kind of go back and say, no, this was exceptional. So how did that process of kind of recovering these memories work? You know, because your background, you're a novelist, you know, and this is, well, it's not a novel, but, you know, what did you do? You went back to all the people and reconstructed all this.
I did. First of all, it was a draft of my own memories, but obviously using all those, you know, it's written, all those tools, I would say, of fiction, but just the tools, because it's written in the first person present tense. So I am that kid, and I'm standing in the shoes of that memory, and I am there in that moment when, you know, Ozzy's dancing in the graveyard or whatever is happening. But all of these stories we all have family stories, so they were family stories, but they weren't, because it was such a short period of time, they weren't that important to my family, you know, into the late 80s, 90s, beyond. They were more, oh yes, that happened, didn't it? Let's, you know, my mother's very much, let's move on. So then the second layer was going back to my mother, and trying to get her memories straight, as much as we can get memories straight, and trying to get her to actually lock into that past. And so that took a long time. I mean, she's 81 now. So, and it started about 10, 15 years ago, because this second novel, Diamond Star Halo, is set at an imagined Rockfield. So I'd gone back to the place. So now I wanted to go back to our specific memories. So it was a task, but also joyous, interviewing my mother, because she's got no patience, so she really could not be bothered. She was like, "Oh God, I've got to go out to lunch. What are you talking about?"
So she didn't like doing it. Mark and I often talk about this.
Yeah.
interviewing relations. My experience is they love talking about it, but your mother didn't.
She just couldn't. Nobody will be interested in this. Who cares? So I was trying to.
I think deep down she must have known that they would have been. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, even to the point where I had the fine. It was about to be printed before Christmas. And I really did have to sit her down and read it at her, which sounds very aggressive, but it was the only way because I had to get her to clear it.
I must just ask about her because she's obviously one of the big characters, if not the big character actually of the book, and she's got this wonderfully kind of schoolmistress way. She's obviously a major hippie, but a schoolmistress way of controlling these rock stars. And at one point you printed her set of rules. Give us some examples of the rules that she'd set to make rock stars conform and behave.
Well, she'd the one that people have latched onto is she genuinely said this to me. She said I would make my list of rules and I would say, don't, because she was very, very attractive and she'd walk around in a see-through caftan. By the way, I think she'd be appalled that you think she's a hippie. But
oh right, sorry.
Joking, it's fine. And so she'd say, don't come in and chat me up when I've got, I'm up to my elbows in duck fat, and do not grab the cook's tits from behind. That was another thing. And, when she said this to me,
I'm talking to you, Black Sabbath. Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, Mum, that's terrible. She said, oh, don't be silly. It was fine. Because it was this, sort of, and then there was a schoolboy thing of don't say you don't like it if you've never tried it, that line, and her other bugbear were the food fights, because the bands in Studio 2 didn't really have a hell of a lot of record money behind them, so they didn't have her to cook for them, so the roadies would come up in the middle of the night, nick all her food from the fridge. She would hit the roof. The queen scallops or whatever it was.
Classic.
And so she'd persuade these roadies to do jobs for her so they could have, then she'd cook for them. But then she'd have rules of food fights, because sometimes they'd actually have the food fights within the actual control room. And once,
which just seems incredible,
it's
really.
Just
so there's
stupid.
blancmange going down the faders, it's just awful. These are grown men away from home, clearly.
There's a long history of food fights in rock and roll. It's pathetic, but it has gone on for a long, long time.
Yeah, eat the food, don't wear it.
Yeah,
it's that, isn't it? Yeah.
Ridiculous. It's horrible.
Well, I suppose the understanding behind that is A, they hardly ate, really, if we're honest. B, they were kind of boys who were used to, touring in transit vans and greasy spoon cafes or takeaways. It was that boys' school thing. It was very sort of this at times wonderful, at times really frustrating, childlike quality to these musicians. But she told me this story of A, she fuel to the fire, because she'd always do a bloody trifle. But she said
that's asking for it.
That's asking for it. And she said once the poor engineers had to get all these what are they called? The things you stick in your ears to clean your ears.
Buds.
Buds.
Q-tips.
Q-tips. Thank you. To clean in between the
faders.
The faders of the motherboard, and they had to take the whole thing apart, and they couldn't record for 3 days. But I suppose back then, the record.
So there could have been no Bohemian Rhapsody, because the whole thing would have been just stuck full of trifle.
Well, I think Queen were a little more sensible. They were all very. I remember the smell of sort of lemon and honey. And,
you see, there's a real difference. I thought that was one of the things that struck me reading it. Is most of these bands, they'd come straight from school. They'd gone on the road. Queen were different. Brian May had been to university.
Yeah.
There was a bit of polish there. They were a bit older, and they're really different generation of rock and roll stars from the ones that you have nowadays.
Yeah.
They were 10 years younger for a start. You know what I mean? They were quite unsophisticated in loads of ways.
Yeah.
And presumably your mother, I mean, was they weren't used to dealing with women. Is that right? Fair to say? Most of their kind of working environments were male. Is that right?
I mean, that's a repeated
Sorry, that's
line.
my granddaughter in the background.
Oh, hello.
All right, mister.
Carry on.
No, it's a repeated line of the book. They're always men. They're always men, because it was, the 1970s, and they were always men. Mum always said to me, "It was such a pity, darling, you missed Joan Armatrading, because she was there."
The sole woman.
I mean, of course, there were a few.
Susie at one stage, I think.
Yeah, late. I mean, that was in the very, very early 80s. But she did. You're right. She did have this matron sort of appeal in the body of, let's say, Julie Christie from Darling, I suppose.
Yeah.
And because she was alone, we were both alone with the bands. The Rockfield families have, houses further down the track, and we were actually in the quadrangle with the band. So not only did she have to corral them, not just into eating and trying new things, she'd give them menus and persuade them to certain foods. Like, for instance, she was paid extra to get some food into Lemmy, and there was this whole kerfuffle of sitting him down at the table and saying, "What about boeuf on croute?" And he was like, "Oh, you're taking a piss, Joan." And she told me that he poured a half-pint glass of Jack Daniels and said, "You drink that, Joan. I'll eat whatever you put in front of me." And she gave it a go, but she just couldn't manage it.
Right.
So it was bacon sandwiches after that, and I had to deliver it to Motorhead in Studio 2, because Fritz was producing them, because Dave Edmonds ran away, I think.
When did you first realise or recognise, I suppose, the people who came? Was it the Shawaddy Waddy moment? There was some group that I think it might have been Shawaddy Waddy, and you'd seen them on Top of the Pops, and so you were quite excited about them arriving, and then they turn up. There are no quiffs, no brothel creepers, no drapes. I think you described them as looking like just a load of kind of rather old middle-aged men or whatever.
Yeah, I still adore Shawaddy Waddy, and no disrespect to them whatsoever, but it was I could just feel my heart sinking that, Romeo wasn't wearing his pink teddy boy suit, and Dave wasn't in green, and no brothel creepers, and they were just sitting at the table in T-shirts. But they were lovely, and they were the first and only band that I got an autograph from, because I was so excited. And that process of asking for an autograph was one of the most embarrassing process of my entire childhood. So I never, ever did it again. I didn't, but I still have the book with their autograph in. So yes, I mean, amazing bands passed me by as a kid. From Van der Graaf Generator to Queen to Black Sabbath and Rush. And I just went in for Shawaddy Waddy in 1977.
I went there once it must have been the late 70s, and I've been racking my brains to think who I'd gone to. I must have gone to write some piece for Sounds, or I can't remember who, about some band who happened to be making a record there. It might have been the Tyler Gang. It might have been Lou Lewis Reformer. And as I was racking my brains, I was thinking, how many never to be heard of again bands went through there? You know what I mean? You tend to focus on the Queens and the David Bowies or whatever, but there's just these millions of foot soldiers who go through these places, aren't there? You know what I mean? And they have their 2 weeks there or whatever.
Yeah.
Can you remember? Do you ever find yourself going, I wonder what ever happened to them? Or does this happen?
Well, the book was very much a process of that as well, because you said Tyler Gang.
Yeah.
Because I think Fritz produced that album.
He probably
did.
No, and that was one I mean, it probably wasn't shelved, but that not only is it bands who are forgotten or not so well known, it's also those albums from bands who become well known in the future, but then that's shelved.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Yes,
and also, they didn't pay the bill very often. The record, they'd fall out with the record company. So this stuff ended up remaining at the studio.
Yeah.
Is very often what happened, didn't it?
Yeah. I think I could be wrong. Anybody out there who knows better, but Brits produced a small I suppose it was a 4-track thing for, I think it was RCA, of Squeeze, and that the record company didn't do anything with it, so it stayed at Rockfield. And I think that Chris Difford might have, or somebody from Squeeze might have, Rockfield said, oh, somebody came from Squeeze and picked it up about 6 months ago. And what are we? We're like 2024 now.
Yeah.
So it'd been there for like almost 40, 50 years.
Absolutely.
It
happens. It happens
I don't
a lot.
do maths.
It happens a lot because studios close. I mean, it's a miracle Rockfield's still there, when you consider how many studios in the UK have just
you think how cheap it is to record at home.
And stuff gets chucked into skips.
Yeah.
Master tapes go into skips regularly. You know what I mean? They need to be rescued. Because if you're going to rescue them, you have to have the space to put them somewhere. And then you have to go through them and go, who is this again? Or, who's the copyright holder here? Who do I have to clear this with? It's a really interesting aspect of the.
Were your friends at school impressed? I think at one point you brought some back to stare at some band. I can't remember who it was now, but presumably they must have been pretty impressed with the life that you led.
Well, not because I was so young. When I was at the old vicarage, which was the rehearsing space, that's when I brought some kids from my primary back to see Queen, because I was fascinated by Freddie. And they were impressed just because they were people from London. Oh, was people from London in your house? Oh, look, they play instruments. That's
a novelty. Yeah.
And then all the parents were very, very, angry, and my mum got into trouble. But then at Rockfield, of course, because it's so close to Monmouth, I was an extra Rockfield kid. The real Rockfield kids, 5 of them, the sons and daughters of Charles and Kingsley, we all went to school in Monmouth. So I think Rockfield and the musicians then have always been normal, if you like, for Monmouth. Not impressed really at all, because they'd be in the pub, they'd be in the various restaurants walking down the street anyway. So going to Monmouth Comprehensive and saying, oh, David Bowie was at the table, people would be like, oh, all right then.
Can you remember David Bowie? He was only there very fleetingly, wasn't he?
He was there.
What can you remember of him?
I remember his red trousers. Very exciting for an 11-year-old. And I remember serving him food in the dining room and being just so absolute. I just didn't know what to do with myself. And my hand was shaking as I gave him the plate. He didn't really eat, just milk. But what I remember most, rather than the actual incidents, is what everybody said about him being there, even at the time. It became this it was a atypical Bowie myth. It was he there for 24 hours, or was he there for a month? Was he there for a week? Did Sandra pick him up from Newport Station with the black lad Jason in the back in her Volvo, or did he come in an aeroplane? Nobody can pin it down, even the genuine Rockfield people. Somebody says this, somebody else says that.
But you must have been aware from all of that you were dealing with somebody of enormous significance.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I knew exactly who he was, because I was schooled on Bowie by my mother from 72 onwards. And then I was schooled on Bowie by the 2 oldest Rockfield kids, Karina and Bridget, who would, they'd play me Diamond Dogs and Hunky Dory, everything. So I was obsessed with him by the time the summer of 79 came around. And still am.
So give us some idea of your mother's background, because she's obviously maybe not a hippie, but a scenester, shall we say? You know what I mean?
She does come across a bit of a hippie. A lot of caftans.
She used to live at the back of Harrods and so forth, and she was there in the swinging 60s. Go on, give us an idea of that.
Well, she's a farmer's daughter, and she managed somehow to study at the Cordon Bleu School in London. So she escaped Herefordshire in the early 60s, because when she was at boarding school, she found these Elizabeth David books, and she said that was it. Age 12, she was cooking Christmas lunch, with the Mediterranean flavour, to which my grandparents were, rather appalled. I didn't quite know what to do. But she said the farmhouse kitchen, it really was, it was a genuine farmhouse kitchen with everything that comes with that, from, killing to preserving to making. So the women of the village would all come in, and she would be fascinated by them from an early age. So then in London, with her freedom, which was via work, she not only cooked, but she said one of her first jobs, which is why she focused on cooking, was being she worked for a private detective, and she had to hide in a wardrobe and spy on the Duchess of Argyll. She thinks in the Dorchester, but she's not quite sure. So that kind of, she'd go to parties and the Rolling Stones would be playing, all of that 60s girl stuff. So when she came back to Herefordshire, I think she bought a little of that with her. She had a purple beach buggy with a
come
on. She was.
I know,
purple beach buggy. It's a movie already. I can see her approaching through in the dawn on King's Road, with balloons coming off the back of the buggy.
Bieber dresses, which she still has in her wardrobe.
Does she really? Movie.
She's still got the Bieber dresses.
Yeah, she's still got the Bieber dresses and these, the floppy hats and yeah.
So to what extent are you? Was your upbringing? Were you in any sense like Saffy from Absolutely Fabulous? I'm just intrigued by this because I don't meet many people whose mothers were kind of girls who were out there in the 60s.
Well, I don't know what you mean, but yes, no. I'm being silly. Yes, absolutely. In that I was a swot at school. I went on, I became an academic, got a PhD, became a novelist while my mum's still drinking and partying. She lives in Portugal, aged 81. So yeah.
Really?
Absolutely.
Do you ever have those conversations about, now, mother, I really think you should settle down?
You're not going out wearing that, surely.
Do you seriously?
What kind of time to call this?
Yeah, they have been going on since I was in my mid-20s. Yeah, those conversations. And now I'm in my mid-50s, and it's getting to the point where they're like, please, mum, please. She's like, I can do what I want. But she's right now. She can do exactly what she wants.
Absolutely. Yeah. And always could.
And always could, and she always did.
So what does she think of the book?
She loves it. She finally listened to it. The only thing she said to me, because of course this is from a child's point of view, the only thing she said to me, she said, well, you don't really go into the fun I had, which we can, we know what that means at Rockfield. Yeah. And I said, well, Mum, it is, it's from a child's point of view. Yes. And,
you think she should have been really relieved you didn't?
Yes, quite.
She was really upset. She said, well, what about me? I come across as really boring. I'm like, no, you probably don't, Mum. You're fine. But
right. Well,
so who are the ones that just stood out as strong memories? There's a whole list of people who came. Dr. Feelgood, really interesting. Wilco Johnson, Horselips, Julian Cope. I mean, were there any particular bands you have really particular vivid memories of?
I think when I was very, very young, it's almost like I knew Queen from the vicarage. So yes, they were a strong memory when they were there in the summer of 75, doing Bohemian Rhapsody, because that's really what they focused on. But it was the new person who I'm sure I was a bit of a child stalker, but I just loved Nick Lowe. He was there a lot with Dave Edmunds, and they'd walk around the tracks, and he was just so tall and kind, and he had this wonderful nose. He looked like a bird of prey, I thought. And I just
you say you fancy him, but you're not sure what fancying somebody actually means. But you declare that you fancy Nick Lowe.
Well, he still is tall, isn't he?
He's still
that hasn't
still
changed.
is kind, and he's still got the hair.
He's still got the hair.
That's the amazing thing.
Yeah, and he was so. This is like a stalker. I did contact him and say, hey, I hope you don't mind. You're in the book and blah, blah, blah. And he came to my launch in London.
Oh,
Isn't that lovely? Isn't that gorgeous?
You can't do better than that.
I was wondering if there were people that you'd met subsequently that you'd known who were on there. Are there any of the bands who were there when you were kind of 7 or 8 and you've seen since and reminded them of it?
I've only just talking to them, either on the phone or in emails. But two stand out is Graham Parker. He was just so lovely. He got back to me immediately and he was like, I remember your mum's trout. And he was talking about the trout. And he was like, yeah, I remember it was like almonds on it and it was really fresh. And he said that because they 2 albums there, it was Heat Treatment really in summer of 76. And he said, I remember being in the studio and just waiting for that meal and knowing that it was the focus and I could get to it and it was wonderful and it was 3 course. And so that, that wonderful, and I was talking to Lisa Ward, who's, is the manager of Rockfield now, one of the daughters. And she said, yeah, it's so important. And it was so important for these bands to have that focus. And it didn't matter when it was served. If you're in and you're doing a take, you're not going to stop for 7:30 supper, are you? But even if it's 2 a.m, to know you have that focus of good food is really, really important.
Yeah, because otherwise there's no focus on the day. Because the whole point of Rockfield was the beginning of that getting your head together in the country, wasn't it? It's the idea that the band should bond, and all the time there are people sitting around while all the drum patterns are being laid down with nothing to do.
Yeah,
so,
and that was the joy of it, and sometimes the horror for some bands, because that was it. That's all they had, and they didn't know what to do.
I suppose also you got to remind yourself this is the late 70s, early 80s, where there's no Uber. There's no Uber Eats. You're out in the middle of the country, and if your mum's not cooking for you, you're going to go to bed hungry, aren't you?
Yeah, and it was before pot noodles.
Absolutely. A reminder of an extraordinary time. There it is.
It is. It's a brilliant book.
My Family and Other Rock Stars by Tiffany Murray, out now. Read it to your mother.